Hello, listeners. This is Kat, and welcome back to Put Your Hands Up Podfic. This will be the reading of the one-shot When Shopping with Soul Animals. This is the direct follow-up to When Your Soul Animal Comes Around. So if you've listened to that fic already, this is the follow-up to that one, in the same series that the author did entitled When Soul Animals Appear. Here's the summary. After all of Class 1A get their soul animals, Aizawa has to take them to the soul animal store so they can get supplies and learn more about their new soul animals. Aizawa sighed as he led his 20 students and all their new soul animals into the soul animal store. He was glad he had Yamada with him as moral support because he isn't sure he would survive otherwise. They had all gotten their soul animals on the same day. He had originally planned to ease them into soul animals and what it was like, what to expect, what to do. As the first students in his class started getting their soul animals, he was going to begin having a few lessons on them here and there, so the rest of the class could begin getting used to the idea. His plan did not include all his students getting their soul animals on the same day, let alone 14 of them being soulmates. His students may not have noticed, but he was paying attention. Oh, so close attention. He knew already, in the short amount of time he had been around them, who were soulmates. It was also clear to him which soul animals were going to be the most trouble. The invisible bird, pink owl, blue skunk, electric mouse, pink jaguar, and Pomeranian were the most glaringly obvious troublemakers. But the one that topped them all without even doing a thing yet was the green sheep and his cursed red shoes. The moment Aizawa saw the sheep and his shoes, he knew. He would now have to deal with not only the most problematic of problem children, but his soul representation as well. Aizawa sighed again. Why did all of my students have to get their soul animals on the same day? Hizashi, why does the universe hate me so much? Yamada laughed and turned to look at the class following behind them. They were all excitedly talking to each other and their soul animals. Each one of them had a large smile on their face. They are a special class, aren't they? They are a problem class, that's what they are. Yamada laughed again. Give them a break, Shota. Don't you remember how excited you were when you got Chatterbox? Aizawa scoffed. Of course he remembered getting Chatterbox, the excitement of getting a soul animal and realizing just who a soulmate was, but that didn't mean he had to enjoy getting 20 new troublemakers that he had to deal with on top of the 20 problematic ones he already had. Just because I understand doesn't mean I have to like it, he deadpanned. Yamada chuckled as they walked up to the service desk in the store. The woman behind the counter looked very surprised to see the two heroes, and even more surprised to see the famous 1A kids behind them. She took a moment to collect herself before greeting them. Hi, I'm Ashiko. How can I help you today? I'm Aizawa. I made a call to your manager earlier to set up an emergency soul animal information Q&A. I have a large group of students who all got their soul animals at the same time, and have not had any classes on the subject. Ashiko nodded, and looked behind Aizawa, her eyes once again widening, only just registering all the soul animals with the kids. She shook her head and began typing on the computer. Aizawa Shota? It's right here. Let me go get my manager and we will get everything started. Aizawa nodded, and Ashiko ran off to find the manager. Look at them all. You can't possibly be upset about this, Yamada said. Aizawa turned to see his class, blindingly bright with their smiles. Even Todoroki was smiling, which isn't something Aizawa thought he would ever see. Todoroki and Midoriya were holding hands and petting their respective soul animals, with love in their eyes. Koda was having a conversation with his pony. Sato was holding his pig tight to his chest, much like Sero was, though his skunk was clearly the most skittish of all the soul animals. Aizawa would have to start working on that right away. Why did the skunk have to be the most nervous? There was a reason she was on his most problematic soul animal list. Ida was lecturing to the owl in his arms. Kaminari and Ashido were playing with their soul animals, the jaguar and Pikachu. Yes, Aizawa had already heard about the name choice and could see problems in the future, but there wasn't anything he could do now. Yaoyorozu's wolf and Jiro's dog were circling each other, their owners watching them with large smiles. The frog and sugar glider were floating around, Uraraka and Asui poking them to help them, giggling as they did. Aoyama was trying to hug his raccoon, but he wasn't having it. Hagakure and Ojiro were talking. A blush on Ojiro's face. Aizawa was sure Hagakure was blushing too. They just couldn't see it. The monkey was hugging the invisible bird, who was chirping contentedly. Kirishima was talking animatedly to Bakugo, who was scoffing. Only the faint blush on his cheeks gave him away. Both were holding their soul animals to their chest. Of all the class, Tokiyami, Shoji, and Shinso were the most unchanged. Shinso blinked sleepily, his otter wrapped around his neck. Tokiyami and Shoji were having a quiet conversation like they normally would. It didn't seem like anything had changed between them, besides the soul animals resting on their shoulders. Aizawa sighed. He could admit to himself that it was nice seeing the smiles on their faces. They had been through more than the third years, and they needed a break. Not that he would ever admit it out loud. Yes, I can. They are all problem children, and now they're problem soul animals. Yamada shook his head. Only you, Shota. Ashiko walked around the corner, another woman with her. She had a long brown braid, purple eyes, and wore the green and brown uniform of the store. On her shoulders was a deep blue snake. Hello, Aizawa, she said, and shook his hand. I'm Ikuyo, the manager. You're the one who wanted the emergency soul animal information Q&A, right? Aizawa nodded tiredly and motioned to the class behind him. Ikuyo's eyes widened at the size of the group. I've never seen or heard of a group this big getting their soul animals all at once. Your class must be very special. You can say that again, Aizawa muttered. Yamada elbowed him and laughed loudly. Special indeed. Ikuyo smiled. If you would all follow me to the conference room, we can get this Q&A started. The group followed behind her, weaving through the many aisles all the way to the back of the store. Ikuyo unlocked a door, and the group filed in. Inside was what looked like a lecture hall, with desks and chairs facing the front of the room, each row rising a level so everyone can see. Ikuyo motioned to the desks. Everyone please take a seat and we can begin. She then turned to Ashiko and said something to her. Ashiko nodded and left the room. Aizawa and Yamada sat at the side of the room so they could keep watch over everyone. The class, as well as their soul animals, were buzzing with energy. Aizawa sighed. It was Saturday. He would be sleeping right now if it wasn't for those soul animals. Yamada rubbed Aizawa's arm. Relax, Shota. When this is over, we can head home and cuddle on the couch and watch a movie or something, okay? Aizawa leaned into Yamada and nodded, before sitting back up. Until then, he would have to babysit his 40 troublemakers. Is everyone settled in and comfortable? Ikuyo asked. The room immediately fell silent, all attention on her. Aizawa taught his class well. The group nodded their heads, and Ikuyo smiled. Great, let's get started then. She clapped her hands together. Let me start by introducing myself. My name is Ikuyo Kuriko. I'm the manager of SoulMap, as well as a soul animal specialist. I have a master's degree in anima meology and a bachelor's degree in zoology. This, she picked the blue snake up from off her neck, is Satoshi, my soul animal. Satoshi coiled himself around Ikuyo's arms. I understand that you are all here because you got your soul animals earlier today, correct? Many affirmations passed through the room, as well as sounds from the different animals. Ikuyo looked at them all with curiosity. I've never heard of so many soul animals appearing at the same time, but I am glad to see that you didn't run into any troubles despite that. Ikuyo's smile never faded. Today, I'm going to tell you all about soul animals, what to expect, what to do, what not to do, how soul animals are different from normal animals, and everything in between. Please feel free to raise your hand and ask questions at any time. Now, does anyone know the difference between a soul animal store and a normal pet store? Asui rose her hand, and Ikuyo motioned to her. Pet stores are for normal animals that have much different needs than soul animals. Pet stores are also very basic and don't require the workers to have any special credentials. Anyone can work there. Soul animal stores are a lot more specialized. The workers must have the correct credentials, and they provide much different services than pet stores. Soul animal stores educate the public about soul animals and provide things you wouldn't be able to get anywhere else. They also function as a vet for soul animals. Ikuyo smiled widely. Perfect. I couldn't have put it better myself. She clapped her hands. Now that we got that out of the way, why don't you tell me what you already know about soul animals? Aizawa watched as multiple hands went up. He noticed Yaoyorozu, who was almost always on top of her game, did not raise her hand. She was looking down at her lap embarrassed. It was quickly remedied by her wolf putting its head in her lap and licking her. Yaoyorozu must not know a lot about soul animals, but considering how she grew up, it did make sense. Ikuyo called on Ashido first. Soul animals are representations of your soulmate. They even have their quirk. It's so cool. They show up sometime between the age of 15 and 21. The first person they will let touch them is always their person. Once they accept a name, it cannot be changed. There are strict laws in place about messing with a happy soul pair. Ikuyo nodded as each person gave their input. A soul animal won't attack another soul animal or people unless their person tells them to. Once a soul animal finds its pair, they won't want to leave them and become very attached, Ada said. If one half of a soul pair dies before the other gets their soul animal, they will never get their soul animal. This is all great information, Ikuyo said. Do you have anything else? Midoriya raised his hand. Soul animals have been around just as long as humans, and definitely way before quirks existed. Before quirks came about, people looked much plainer. They didn't have crazy hair colors and skin tones like today. Soul animals reflected that. They looked just like normal animals. Because of that, it was much harder to figure out who your soulmate was. The only thing they had to go on was their soul animal's personality and how each other's soul animals acted around each other. It was common for people to never know for sure if they had found their soulmate or not. This also caused there to be a lot more marriages between people who were not soulmates. Sometimes, people who didn't even think they were soulmates because of how their soul animals reacted around each other would get married because they loved one another and didn't want to go through life looking for someone who they would never even know for sure they had found. Today we have quirks. It is much easier to find your soulmate. Soul animals look a lot more distinct, and it is now a standardized practice to ask someone what their quirk is if you think they could be the one. If what they say matches the quirk your soul animal has and vice versa, then you've found your soulmate. The ease at which we can now find our soulmates has also made it taboo to be with someone who is not your soulmate. When Midoriya finished speaking, the class stared at him blankly. They had clearly not known that before. Leave it to Midoriya to know the history of anything. Ikuyo began clapping. Bravo! That was a great summary of the history of soul animals. Midoriya flushed at the praise. Todoroki smiled at him and took his hand. Well, now that I know what you already know, we can go from there. I would first like to touch on one of the facts that you gave me. She looked at Ida. You are correct in saying that when a soul animal finds its pair, they become very attached. They will do anything they can to convince their person to let them stay together. However, their person will always overrule staying with their pair. If their person tells them to go with them, they will. This is especially true when you first get your soul animal. This is the first thing I want to touch on. It is very important, especially for young heroes in training, that you begin training your soul animals early. The class perked up. When you first get your soul animal, they become extremely attached to you. Did anyone notice that your soul animal won't leave your side even for a moment? Nods went through the room. That is because your soul animal is afraid to leave you. Murmurs went through the class. It is unknown where soul animals come from, however, they have to come from somewhere. The most widely accepted theory is that they come from another plane because your soul animals will always be the same age as your soulmate. They had to have been born and raised somewhere before finding you. It is believed that they are born and raised in this other plane, always knowing that they are missing a piece of themselves until the day between the age of 15 and 21, that they somehow transfer over into our plane. From there, the soul animal searches for their person, and once they find them, they are scared to leave them because they fear that if they do, they won't be able to find them again. The group jumped as, around the room, their soul animals cried out, each one getting as close to their person as possible. Ikuyo smiled sadly. That is a prime example right there, and exactly why you all need to start training right away. If not trained properly, soul animals are prone to extreme separation anxiety. Even the thought of being away from you right now is a terrifying prospect. For young heroes in training, if you don't start working on this immediately, it could be detrimental to your career. The soul animal wouldn't leave your side, and unless you train them for hero work, it would slow you down tremendously. The students looked terrified. Aizawa sighed. It was terrible to think about, but it was the truth. He was very glad that Ikuyo was covering it, though. Otherwise, he would have had to go over it and take up class time. Ikuyo seemed to have tailored the Q&A with his class in mind, which he was eternally grateful for. Now, before we move on, I would like to cover a few more things about the theory and some facts. In this theory, during the time in their plane, they are friends with other soul animals, as well as already with their soul pair, before they find their way here. That is why, as I'm sure you've noticed, some of the soul animals were already friends when they got here, and why they are so attached to their soul pair. Your soul animals are also a good way to gauge how you will be with different people. If your soul representation hates another soul animal, chances are you will also hate the person that soul animal represents. On a sadder note, I would also like to point out that your soul animal will live to the age that the person they represent would have lived to naturally, without any interference, or until both parts of a soul pair are dead. The mood immediately darkened. The soul animals were not so happy anymore. Aizawa closed his eyes for a moment. Reality was harsh, and for heroes. Yamada squeezed his hand. When Aizawa opened his eyes, he was smiling at him. Aizawa relaxed. I know this is not something you are going to want to hear, Ikuyo said, taking in the atmosphere. but I felt this is something you as heroes should know. The class was frowning, but didn't protest. If someone were to be killed by something other than old age, the soul representation will continue living until the age that person would have lived to without intervention, unless, of course, the soul animal is killed by outside intervention first. If both parts of a soul pair die before their time, then, because the soul animals no longer have a connection to this plane, they will die. If a soul animal's person dies, they will go to their pair's person. A soul animal can be killed by outside forces and things like thirst and hunger like normal animals. However, when it comes to illness, they have diseases that are specific to soul animals and them alone. Does anyone know what some of these illnesses are? Everyone's hand went up. Ikuyo called on Tokiyami. Soul morose. It is an illness that happens when a person the soul animal represents becomes severely depressed. The soul animal will also become depressed. And as the case worsens, the animal will stop eating and moving. In the worst-case scenario, if the person were to kill themselves, the soul animal would die. The room became very solemn. Ikuyo nodded and sighed. You are correct. Soul morose, or by its technical term, anema catalepsy, is one of the most well-known soul animal illnesses. This is, of course, not only because of its popularity with the media, but also because of how serious a condition it is. Because the illness of the soul animal depends on another person, it is impossible to treat unless you are helping the person it is coming from in the first place. That means that when a soul animal gets soul morose, it is a race for their person to find their soulmate and help them. The drama of this illness is why it has become such a common trope in the media, but unlike the movies, the story does not always end happily. For many, they can't find their soulmate in time. This is a very serious illness, so please treat it as such. Ikuyo clapped her hands and smiled, her voice taking on a much happier tone. Now, what other illnesses do you know of? Where before every hand in the room was raised, now only Midoriya's was. Midoriya flushed a little when he realized he was the only one with his hand still up, but didn't put it down. Ikuyo laughed and called on him. Let's see what you got. Well, there is soul fever, which is when a soul animal does not get enough affection. They become depressed and touch can even hurt. It is very similar to being touch-starved. Then there's hollow soul, which happens when a soul animal is away from their pair or their person for too long. They will begin to starve in the same way they would if they weren't eating any food. But in this case, no matter what they eat, they will still starve until back with their person or pair, whichever it is that is causing the grief in the first place. Soul animals are especially susceptible to weeping void when their person or pair dies. Then there are also illnesses that have nothing to do with the connection, like soulpox, which, despite its name, has nothing to do with the soul. It is just an illness that soul animals can get that causes red splotches around their body, and in soul animals with fur, can cause clumps of it to fall out. It is easily treated, though, if brought to a soul animal store like this. Ikuyo clapped. Well done. You clearly know your stuff about soul animals. Midoriya blushed and looked down, leaning into Todoroki. You are, of course, correct on all accounts. What you all need to know is this. Like normal animals, there are many different types of illnesses and diseases your soul animal could get. It would be impossible for every person to know about every sickness, so instead, just make sure that if your soul animal is showing signs that something is wrong, you bring them to a soul animal store right away to have them checked out. I don't want to scare you. Many illnesses aren't too bad and can be easily treated, but like we've talked about, some are very dangerous and need to be treated immediately. Nods went around the room. Aizawa noticed many of them holding their soul animals a little closer after that whole spiel. Now that that's out of the way, let's talk about something happier. The differences between normal animals and soul animals. Ikuyo perked up a lot at this topic. We have already talked about some of the differences when it comes to illnesses, but that isn't all. First off, soul animals are much more intelligent than normal animals. Most of the time, soul animals can understand what you were saying. Did you notice how your soul animals reacted to some of our discussion topics? Eyes widened as they came to the realization. All the animals seemed to be a bit proud as the class looked at them all in wonder. Aoyama's raccoon in particular seemed very proud, bordering boastful. Its head was stuck up in the air like it was better than everyone else. At least it was until Aoyama scooped him up and hugged him tightly. Sadly, because they are animals, they can't talk back, but they can still use their body and sounds to communicate with us. That's not all. I'm sure some of you might have wondered what would happen if someone was allergic to their soul animal, but worry not, that is literally impossible. We don't understand how exactly it works, but no one can be allergic to a soul animal. Someone deathly allergic to cats would be perfectly fine around a cat's soul animal, and unlike normal animals, soul animals don't get allergies at all, of any kind. Even if the person they represent is allergic to, let's say, fish, the soul animal would be fine eating fish. The class sat in awe at the new information. Midoriya was nodding his head like he already knew about it, but was no less amazed. Aizawa noticed his hand was twitching. He must be itching to write this stuff down. Soul animals also don't, if they would normally hibernate. During the time its counterpart would be hibernating, the soul animal may be extra sleepy, but other than that, it acts exactly like it normally would. Then it comes to things like growing. Ikuyo looked around the room at each of the soul animals. She smiled when she saw the sheep. She pointed at Todoroki. You right there with the sheep. What's the sheep's name? Hero, Todoroki said. Aizawa sighed and pinched the bridge of his nose. That was simultaneously the sweetest and most irritating thing he had ever heard. The more he learns about the sheep Hero, the more he wishes he had never become a teacher. Beside him, he hears Yamada awing. Midoriya had gone completely red. Ikuyo herself paused in her excitement to look back and forth between Todoroki, Midoriya, and their soul animals. That's adorable, she whispered. Todoroki began to turn a bit red himself. Ikuyo cleared her throat. Anyway, Hero is a perfect example. Normally with sheep, you have to shave them at least once a year. If you don't, they could overheat and die, or they could become infected, or a whole list of other things. However, with your sheep, you don't have to shave him. At a certain point, his wool will stop growing. And as long as you brush and bathe him, you will never have to shave him. You can, of course. It would be a free source of wool for you, and if you learned how, you could turn it into things. She then pointed at Midoriya. You are in a similar situation, but yours is even more interesting. She was shaking with excitement as she looked at the deer. Normally, a deer having 2 different-sized antlers would be awful. You would need to cut the bigger one down so the deer doesn't get hurt, but yours is a soul animal, so it's much different. Your soul animal came that way, so that is its normal state. When its antlers fall off and grow back, they will grow back to the exact same way they are right now, and much like with the sheep, you can use the antlers to make things. Do keep note, you still need to care for things like hooves and nails. They will still grow like normal. Before you all leave today, each of your animals will get a checkup to get put in the system, and we'll tell you what to look for with your specific type of animal. I also highly advise you to do some research on your own about the type of animal your soul animal is. It will give you some insight on some of their different behaviors and what they might need. Ikuyo smiled widely and clapped her hands. That concludes my spiel. Are there any questions before we begin shopping and we start giving each of your soul animals a checkup? Midoriya raised his hand. How do quirks affect soul animals? For example, I know dogs don't sweat, but Balmer could still use Bakugo's quirk even though it relies on his nitroglycerin sweat. Bakugo glared at Midoriya from across the room. Aizawa rolled his eyes. I'm glad you asked. How quirks affect soul animals is one of the most fascinating things about them. For example, that jaguar. Alien Queen, Ashido provided. Aizawa fought back a sigh. Yes, Alien Queen is jaguar, but her eyes and horns aren't normal. However, because they are important characteristics of their soul representation, they override normal animal qualities. This is very common in soul representations of people with mutation quirks. Similarly, the soul dog you're talking about must override normal qualities because he has to be able to use his representation's quirk, so though it is not normal for dogs to sweat, because Balmer needs it to use his quirk, he has the ability to sweat. Does that answer your question? Midoriya's eyes were practically sparkling, and his hand was noticeably twitching. Yes, thank you. Ikuyo smiled. Any other questions? Uraraka raised her hand, looking a bit ashamed. Yes? Ikuyo asked. What if you don't have the money to buy the stuff you need for your soul animal? Aizawa frowned. Just about the whole class knew about Uraraka's financial troubles by now. He was glad he could help her out by having her stay in the dorms. She wasn't paying for rent or for main meals anymore, but that didn't mean she had money to spare. The others frowned at the question, but it was clear few were relieved she asked. Some of their animals would not be cheap to provide for. Ikuyo smiled comfortingly. Don't worry, we have you covered. It works differently depending on the country you're in, but in Japan, when you bring your soul animal to the store for the first time and they do a checkup, we will write down the things that you need. They will all be paid for by the government, as they are the basics that you need for your soul animal. After that, if you still need financial help for your soul animal, then you can sign up for the Soul Animal Financial Aid Program. If your plea is approved, and depending on your soul animal and some other factors, you will be allotted a budget each month that is specifically meant for your soul animal. If that is something that you need to sign up for, just mention it during your soul animal's checkup, and we'll get you the paperwork. Uraraka's face was red, but she looked much more relieved. Many of his other students looked relieved as well. They might be able to afford things they need like food, but they wouldn't be able to afford startup items. Shoji's octopus would need a large tank. They cost a lot of money. Kaminari's jaguar would need a lot of food. Getting enough meat for an animal that large every day would be expensive. Aizawa was glad that when they were building the dorms, they had the forethought to think about the different soul animals that could appear. Thanks to that, all the animals, even the larger ones, will fit comfortably in the dorms. So at least that won't be an issue. Are there any other questions? Ikuyo asked. No one raised their hand. All right then, that concludes our Q&A. The next step is for you all to have your soul animal checked out. Unfortunately, I'm the only one currently available to do the checkups, and they can take a little while for each person, so I would like each of you to wait here. While we do this, then you can go shopping knowing what is already going to be paid for. I'm sure you won't have a problem with waiting here. Think of this as another opportunity to get to know your soul animal better. Judging from the looks of his class, they were anxious to start shopping, but no one objected to waiting. They clearly didn't mind spending more time with their soul animals. Aizawa stood. The eyes of his students went to him immediately. As long as none of you have any objections, I would like to sit on each of your soul animal checkups. I can't without your permission, but considering I am in charge of you all, and in turn your soul animals, I would like to know as much about each of them as I can. Murmurs went through the class, but none of them said no. I don't think anyone would object, Sensei. Ida spoke up. Nods went through the room. Aizawa nodded and turned to Yamada. Will you watch them while we do the checkups? He smiled. Of course, I want to get to know my little listener's soul animals too. Aizawa nodded and turned to Ikuyo. She clapped her hands again. All right then, now that we have all that settled, we can begin. Who would like to go first? Every hand in the room shot up. Aizawa sighed. I'll just pick what order you go in. The easiest to start would probably be... Asui, let's start with you. She nodded and smiled at Uraraka before walking over. Her sugar glider rested on her shoulder. They followed Ikuyo out of the room. She led them down a hall and into a much smaller room, clearly meant for checkups. The room looked well equipped for any animal. There was a large tank split in half with a divider. A large examination table was against the wall. But there was plenty of space for a large animal to stand during a checkup. Cabinets lined the wall, and a stand with all kinds of different paperwork was set to the side. Aizawa took a seat in the corner of the room. Please take a seat there, and place your sugar glider on the table. Asui nodded and sat down on the chair right next to the table. The sugar glider sat on the table but didn't stray too far from Asui. Ikuyo grabbed a clipboard and pulled multiple sheets from the paper stand. She clicked her pen and finally looked at Asui. All right. We are all set to get started. Let's start with your name. Asui Suyu. Ikuyo wrote it down on her clipboard and observed the sugar glider for a moment. There are 6 different types of gliders, but yours is definitely a sugar glider, one of the most common types. She pulled out a tape measure and started measuring the sugar glider. She hummed to herself before putting it away and writing something down. She is an average-size brown and pink sugar glider. Could you put her on the scale, please? She pointed to a small scale on the counter. Asui nodded and put the glider on the scale. The glider was being very calm through everything. Hopefully that meant he wouldn't have to worry too much about this one. Ikuyo looked at the scale and wrote the weight down. Okay, what is her name? Bubble. Do you know who your soulmate is? Uraraka Ochako. And what is her quirk? Asui gave a quick rundown of zero gravity and how it worked. Ikuyo was writing as quickly as she could. When she had finally gotten it all, she set the clipboard down. She checked Bubble over and gave her the all clear. Well, Suyu, you're in luck. Sugar gliders are very easy to care for and very inexpensive. They cost at most about $10 to feed every month. For the most part, feed her food pellets, and for snacks and treats give her fruits and insects every day. If you aren't giving her insects, though, then it is important that you give her vitamins to make up for it. Ikuyo grabbed another sheet of paper and quickly filled it out. She copied it onto another paper before handing it to Asui. This is the list of items that we will provide for you. Anything else you want will have to come out of your own pocket. Having said that, will you need to fill out a soul animal financial aid form? No, Asui croaked. All right then, you're all finished up. I'll take you back to the main room. Bubble jumped onto Asui's shoulder. Aizawa went to stand, but Ikuyo waved him down. You don't have to go back and forth each time. Just give me a name to call and I'll bring them back. Aizawa thought for a second. Uraraka. Ikuyo nodded and left the room with Asui. Aizawa sighed. Bubble didn't seem like she was going to be too much trouble, but she was the first of 20. This was going to be a long afternoon. And what's her name? Ribette. And is it safe for me to assume that the last girl, Suyu Asui, is your soulmate? Yeah, Uraraka blushed. Why don't you tell me about her? Okay, and could I get the soul animal aid form? Of course. Now tell me about Asui and her quirk. Aizawa looked at the frog. Well, at least Rebet didn't seem like she would be much trouble either. So, what is his name? Ingram. Oh, that's a good choice. It means Raven of Peace, right? Shoji nodded. And do you know who your soulmate is? Tokuyami Fumikage. Aizawa had to admit he was a bit surprised by that one. If he didn't know them so well, he would have never known if they didn't say anything. Kraken is a smooth-skinned common octopus, but in the realm of soul animals, he isn't common at all. Aquatic creatures very rarely ever become soul animals. We need to know if he is a fresh or saltwater octopus. Ikuyo led Tokuyami over to the large tank. Hold your hands out over the divider. Kraken will tell us which he is by going into his water. Tokuyami held Kraken over the divider. He went into the salt water. I thought all octopi are saltwater, Tokuyami said as he watched Kraken swim around. They are, but soul animals are sometimes freshwater or both. Kraken looks like he is exclusively saltwater, though. Tokuyami nodded, his eyes never leaving the octopus. Well, he didn't seem too bad. Kraken would be quiet, and if he was like Shoji, then he wouldn't be any trouble at all. I'm just amazed that Kiko was invisible. Though they couldn't see her, they could certainly hear her. She was chirping and flapping all over the place. I think she is a cockatoo, but because I can't hear her, we will have to run DNA to be sure. Aizawa tried not to cringe at all the chirping. He was tired, and this was not helping. Kiko was definitely on the trouble animal list. Abu is so well behaved. I know, and he is so sweet. He is the last boy soul representation, right? Yep. Ojiro is so kind. It's like he sees me, even though I'm invisible. Abu was calm. Not surprising, considering who he represented. It was a good thing, too, because a crazy creature with opposable thumbs isn't ideal. This is one strong girl you have here. The full-grown wolf was quite large and took up a lot of space in the room. She was too big to go on the examination table. Her name is Sakata. Yaoyorozu looked pretty proud of the name. You kids keep surprising me with these meaningful names. Brave warrior, what a wonderful name for a wolf. Yaoyorozu blushed. Sakata was a big animal, but she was being pretty calm right now. Aizawa never really had much trouble with Jiro, aside from her occasionally playing music, too loud in her room. Hopefully that meant Sakata wouldn't be much trouble either. Oh my gosh, I didn't get it at first, but now it makes perfect sense. Kainat, all creation, what a beautiful name. Even Aizawa had to admit that it was a pretty thoughtful name. Kainat, the little cocker spaniel, was sitting on the examination table. She looked pretty poised, much like Yaoyorozu herself. Jiro had a light blush on her cheeks. Thanks. Ikuyo sighed. When I was your age, people were just going by the first thing that popped in their head. There was one boy in my class who named their soul animal Butter because she was small. It was a black rabbit. Who names a black rabbit Butter? Jiro laughed awkwardly. Kainat barked. Ikuyo looked down at Kainat. Right, enough about that. On with the examination. Aizawa could count on Kainat to not be any trouble. Boom. The Pomeranian yipped and growled. Oh, he is an explosive one, Ikuyo laughed. The Pomeranian growled at Ikuyo. Kirishima was using his quirk to hold on to the dog so he couldn't attack anyone. Bomber, calm down. This is a checkup. You have to let her look at you, Kirishima yelled, clearly embarrassed by Bomber's actions. Oh, this is the Bomber that kid was talking about. We should look into his sweat glands then. Aizawa sighed heavily as he watched the scene. He now had Bakugo and Bakugo soul representation in his class. He just hoped they didn't kill someone, or some soul animal before they graduate. He didn't want to deal with the paperwork. Be careful with Quilton. He doesn't need your filthy hands touching him. Bakugo, Aizawa glared. Bakugo growled, but backed off. No wonder Bomber reacted the way he did. This was how Bakugo felt about an examination being done to someone he cares about. Then he must hate going to the doctor's office. Ikuyo laughed it off. Don't worry, Bakugo. Quilton is in excellent hands. I'm the leading expert in this region of Japan. There is nothing to worry about. And this is only a basic examination, nothing more. Bakugo scoffed, but didn't say anything more. Quilton was handling everything much better than Bakugo. He let himself be picked up and flipped over by Ikuyo, and didn't seem to mind being touched and pet. All in all, Aizawa wasn't too concerned about Quilton. It was Kirishima's soul representation, and, well, he caused trouble sometimes. It wasn't enough to be more concerned than he would be about a normal teenager, if there was such a thing. If anything, Aizawa was more concerned Bakugo might become an even bigger problem. He was already being extremely overprotective of Quilton. Ikuyo curled Quilton in her hands. Hey, what are you doing? Bakugo yelled. Testing his flexibility and ability to curl up like a normal hedgehog. Bakugo accepted the answer, but continued to glare at Ikuyo. Aizawa sighed. Pikachu bounced around the room, his whiskers crackling with electricity. Ashido did nothing to try and stop him, instead laughing at the chaos. Ashido, get a hold of Pikachu. Ikuyo can't do the examination until he is sitting still, Aizawa said. Pikachu? Ikuyo asked. Ashido gasped. You already know his name? Aizawa pinched the bridge of his nose. Of course I know about it. There are going to be repercussions for naming him that, but we will deal with that later. Right now, just get a hold of Pikachu. Pikachu, come on, Ashido said, patting the table. Pikachu jumped on, still crackling with electricity. Ikuyo approached the table with large rubber gloves already in place. You know who your soulmate is, right? Tell me about his quirk. Ashido happily began talking about Kaminari's quirk and how he would short-circuit himself. Even if Pikachu wasn't already on the trouble list purely because of the name, he would be on it because, well, he is Kaminari's sole representation, and he has short-circuited the dorms enough times, more than once, to be concerning. So, I'm going to need to fill out that financial aid form, Kaminari said. Alien Queen sat in the middle of the room, too large to go on the examination table. She playfully flicked her tail at Kaminari's legs. No worries, Ikuyo said. With the amount of meat you're going to have to feed her each week, most people would have to get some financial aid. Kaminari sighed in relief and grabbed the paper to begin filling it out. Ikuyo took a scope and began looking in Alien Queen's ears. She pulled back a few seconds later with a frown on her face. She held up the otoscope. It had begun to melt and warp. So, what is her quirk exactly? She asked. Aizawa rubbed his temples. That was one more for the trouble list. Pigalope oinked. Sato was the first of the group that didn't know who their soulmates were yet. That also meant they didn't know the animal's quirk or what their personalities would be like. Not great for Aizawa. He could only hope they would be calm. Do you know what her quirk is yet? Ikuyo asked. Sato shook his head. I know it obviously has something to do with her tail and ears. That is not a normal pig's tail and her ears are way too large, but I really don't have any other clues. Ikuyo stared at Pigalope for a second. So, what is your quirk? Pigalope oinked and jumped. She turned in the air and landed on her tail, which sprung her high in the air. She spread her ears like wings and glided down into Sato's arms. Well, I think that was pretty conclusive, Ikuyo said and began writing on her clipboard. She is like Tigger, with a springy tail, Sato said in awe. He held her up in front of him. Wow, Pigalope, you are amazing. Pigalope oinked happily. Aizawa was still trying to get a read on Pigalope. He wasn't exactly sure how much trouble she would be. Ikuyo was laughing. There it is. I knew at least one of you would choose a name like that. Ottoman Empire rested on Shinso's shoulders. They both blinked tiredly. Ikuyo sucked in a breath and wiped her eyes. So, do you know who your soulmate is yet? Shinso shook his head. Have you seen Ottoman do anything that could lead to what his quirk could be? No, Shinso said. Ottoman has mostly just been sleeping and cuddling with me since I got him. Not much else. Ottoman, would you show us your quirk? Ottoman just stared at Ikuyo in the eye and blinked tiredly. Ikuyo hummed to herself. Well, until he shows sign of his quirk, we won't know what it is. As soon as you find out anything new, please make an appointment with us. Besides the name, Ottoman didn't seem that bad, though without knowing his quirk, he couldn't be sure. Aizawa would keep him off the trouble animal list for now, but that didn't mean he wouldn't be on it later. The pink owl was flying all over the place, like she had gone mad. She practically ran into the walls before turning and flying a different direction, sometimes stopping to stare at an item before flying off just the same. Doctor Who, that is enough. Come here this instant. This is not proper behavior for a place like this. Ida waved his arms around. It wasn't very effective. Aizawa had to hold back a groan as he watched the scene. He could already feel the headaches he would get from dealing with Doctor Who. Do you know who your soulmate is? Ikuyo asked, not at all disturbed by the chaos around her. No, I don't know who she is, or what her quirk is, but I do know that she doesn't follow the rules easily, he exclaimed. He took a deep breath and bowed. I apologize on behalf of my soul animal. Her behavior is unacceptable. Ikuyo laughed. No worries, I have seen a lot worse. Doctor Who landed on Ida's head and looked ashamed, and then Aizawa saw her eyes, brown with crosses. He knew who Ida's soulmate was. He was right to put Doctor Who on the trouble animal list. He wouldn't tell Ida who his soulmate is, though. It's not his place. But he would be keeping a close eye on both of them. Rififi sat as straight as he could on the examination table, his tail stuck high in the air. He looked a bit annoyed as Aoyama kept messing with him, asking if he was okay and comfortable as Ikuyo did the examination. When Ikuyo asked him to demonstrate his quirk, he stood and touched Aoyama. A second later, he shot a laser from his stomach at the wall. A smoking hole was left in the drywall. Aizawa face-palmed. Rififi bent over and clutched his stomach. Aoyama gasped. That was my quirk. Does he have the same quirk as me? Or maybe he can copy my quirk. How magnifique! Your quirk? Ikuyo hummed. I am going to list it as a copy quirk then for now, but as soon as you know more, please make an appointment. Aoyama scooped Rififi in a tight hug again. Rififi squealed and struggled against him, but couldn't escape the hug. A copy quirk. It sounds so familiar, but I feel like I would remember if I found someone with the potential to shine as bright as me. He hugged Rififi tighter, who looked like he was about to be sick. Oh well, I'm sure I will find my love soon. This was only getting worse as they went on. Aizawa already had so many problem animals on his list, and now he has the sole representation of Khan's brat. He had complained to Aizawa enough about the kid to recognize him purely by his attitude, but the quirk was a dead giveaway. He would have to ask Khan for some tricks on dealing with him. He wasn't sure if he wanted Aoyama to figure out who his soulmate is or not. Her name is Honeydew, and her quirk allows her to fire off her horns like projectiles, Koda said softly. He was petting Honeydew's mane. Honeydew sat in the middle of the room patiently as Ikuyo examined her. Interesting. When did she get a chance to use her quirk? She hasn't. She told me what it is. My quirk allows me to understand her. Really? That is amazing. I wish I could talk to Satoshi like that. You are incredibly lucky. And let me just say, if you ever feel like doing volunteer work, we would love to have you come here to help speak with the soul animals. That could really help us with diagnosing them. Koda nodded nervously. I wouldn't mind doing that sometime. His voice was barely above a whisper. Great, Ikuyo said. All right, back to the exam. Aizawa watched Honeydew closely. He would reserve his judgment for now, but he did have a good idea who Koda's soulmate was. Why were there so many kids in this year's Hero Corps soulmates? Flora trembled as Ikuyo approached her. Zero tried to set her down on the examination table, but Flora pushed up against him and tried to climb onto his shoulders. A terrified skunk in a small room. Great. Zero picked up Flora, and she tried to hide herself in his arms. He frowned. Sorry, she was this skittish earlier, too. She gets really nervous around new people. Ikuyo sighed, but didn't try to get closer to her. This isn't going to work. I have to do my examination, but she isn't going to let me get close, she hummed. Do you have any idea what her quirk is yet? Zero perked up. Yes, actually. She got scared when we were waiting for our animals to come to us and used her quirk. It was a gas, but it didn't smell bad, more like flowers, but the gas made everyone in the room feel nervous, so we had to take a break for a while before the animals would come near us again. Midoriya said it probably is an emotion emitter quirk that allows her to induce emotions in other people. He wasn't sure on the specifics, but he sounded pretty sure about that. That is good enough for the time being. Just be sure to make another appointment when you know more. She jotted the information down. I can tell you from looking at her that she is a hooded skunk, but I still have to do her measurements and cover the basics. Do you think you can calm her down enough for that? Zero nodded and pet Flora softly. Flora, I need you to let Mrs. Ikuyo give you a checkup. It'll be okay, and I'll be there the whole time. I won't leave you, I promise. He spent the next 5 minutes doing his best to calm Flora. Aizawa prayed that she wouldn't set her quirk off. It did not sound like one he wanted to deal with right now. He would have to ask Midoriya for his theories later. When Zero calmed her down enough, Ikuyo began the examination. She was quick and efficient without making any sudden movements. Flora sat frozen the whole time while Zero did his best to pet her and keep her calm. All right, that's everything. She is very sweet, but she is one you are really going to have to watch for separation anxiety. I know I already talked to the whole group about this, but for Flora, in particular, it is even more important that you start working with her right away. Flora trembled in Zero's arms. He nodded. I will. Aizawa would have to start on soul animal training classes immediately. Training would be easier for some, given how many already had their soul pairs. But for the ones without them, still would be tricky. Flora, in particular, was going to be a real challenge. With her quirk and personality, she was certainly on the trouble animal list. His quirk is amazing, Midoriya rambled as he pet Snowfall. He can emit fire from his left and ice from his right. There are so many possibilities from simple domestic use to rescue and heroics. Todoroki is already an amazing hero, and now I have Snowfall. I'm sure he'll be of great use on the field as well. Snowfall is so pretty and graceful that I'm sure he can help calm civilians down during rescues, and his quirk will be great to help in battle. And if I'm fighting with both Snowfall and Todoroki, then that is double the power, and there are even more combat moves to do with both of them. I haven't had a chance to see Snowfall use his quirk yet, but I'm sure it'll be amazing. I'll have to start thinking of hero moves to do with him. Midoriya. Aizawa cut him off. Midoriya flushed. Right, sorry. What else do you need to do? I still need to cover the basics and get his measurements. I want to say he's an Eld deer, but there are so many species, and with his colorings, I can't be certain. I'll have to get a DNA sample from him to confirm. She quickly began getting Snowfall's measurements, which went a lot easier than Flora. Snowfall did not care that Ikuyo was messing with him. His eyes were on Midoriya the whole time. It is important that you don't try to ride him. You may think he would be able to carry a human like a horse or a pony, but deer don't have strong enough spines for that. Midoriya frowned. Can he carry other things, like a pack of supplies or something? Ikuyo nodded. I would recommend seeing about getting lessons on this. He should be able to carry things, but you have to be sure to distribute the weight properly or he could get hurt. A lesson or two on how to properly saddle him would be good. Midoriya nodded and began muttering to himself. Snowfall mewed softly and licked Midoriya's hand. He laughed. Snowfall was on the trouble animal list. His soul pair was the biggest problem animal of all of them, and he was sure to get pulled into anything Midoriya did. Todoroki, though quiet, often got into trouble himself. He would have to keep a close eye on Snowfall. As Todoroki walked in, and Hiro trailed behind him, Aizawa's eyes focused in on his red shoes. He sighed, a headache already forming. Ikuyo laughed at the shoes as she grabbed her clipboard and some new sheets. The shoes are absolutely adorable on him. I never would have thought to do that. Midoriya exclusively wears red shoes like these. He has 3 pairs of them. Well, Hiro seems to like them. Hiro showed off his shoes by trotting in place, and then went back to Todoroki to nuzzle against his leg. Just make sure you take them off every night so his hooves have time away from the shoes, and make sure you don't forget to take care of his hooves just because he is wearing those. Todoroki nodded. Ikuyo brought her measuring tape over and began taking measurements and jotting them down. Hiro looked to Todoroki once or twice to make sure that it was okay, but was otherwise compliant. Hiro appears to be a green merino sheep, but there are over 1,000 types of sheep, so a DNA test is necessary. You will also notice that despite being a male, he does not have horns. This is his normal state, so he will never grow any. It's not a bad thing. It's just something that happens occasionally with soul animals. She flipped to a new page. What can you tell me about Midoriya's quirk? Todoroki frowned. Midoriya doesn't talk about his quirk much. I think he mentioned at some point that it's called superpower. He looked to Aizawa for confirmation. Aizawa nodded. Midoriya's quirk is listed as superpower, and is a strength enhancement quirk that uses energy to run. The more he thinks about it, Aizawa doesn't know much about Midoriya's quirk or how it works. Not great considering it can and has broken his bones multiple times. It was a bit strange. Midoriya was willing to talk to anyone about quirks. Aizawa had answered questions about his own quirk multiple times, yet he never talked about his own. He would have to talk to Midoriya about his quirk after this. From the look on Todoroki's face, he was realizing how little he knew, too. He's extremely powerful, but he breaks his bones easily when he overworks himself. I don't really know much more than that. Ikuyo frowned as she wrote on her clipboard. That doesn't sound very good. We don't want Hiro getting hurt. I need more information on his quirk, so I'm going to go get Midoriya really quick so he can answer some more questions. Ikuyo vanished out the door. Hiro bowed and nudged up against Todoroki, suddenly very anxious. Todoroki frowned and crouched down next to Hiro. He mewed and immediately began licking Todoroki's face. What's wrong? Todoroki ran his fingers through Hiro's wool. Hiro butt his head softly against Todoroki's chest and mewed again. Todoroki's brow furrowed, and he looked to Aizawa. He shrugged his arms. He didn't know what the problem was, but it was strange. Clearly something was going on here. Ikuyo came in a moment later with Midoriya and Snowfall. Hiro and Snowfall immediately trotted together when they saw each other. Hiro seemed to communicate something to Snowfall, and they began to nuzzle together. So, what was I needed for? Midoriya asked, his face a little red as he watched Snowfall and Hiro. We need more information on your quirk so I can better update Hiro's file. Aizawa and Todoroki don't seem to know much about it, but mentioned that it was very destructive. I need to know more to make sure Hiro won't get hurt. Midoriya froze. Aizawa could practically see him rebooting. A few seconds later, Midoriya began waving his hands around. My quirk isn't that special. It's just a strength enhancement quirk, nothing more. It's called superpower, and it gives me energy that I can use to make myself stronger. Then why do you break yourself? That is my main concern for Hiro. Oh, that? Midoriya laughed awkwardly, rubbing the back of his neck, his eyes looking everywhere except for Aizawa, Todoroki, and Ikuyo. That's because I didn't know how to use it yet. I was only able to use it at 100% or nothing, and I was concentrating all the power in the place I wanted to be stronger. But that is not a worry now. I figured out how to use it all over, and only use it at about 15% now. As long as Hiro does that too, then he shouldn't ever break anything. You've had that quirk since you were 4. How did you not know how to use it? Aizawa asked. He ignored Hiro's panicked mules and Midoriya's constant shifting. Kikuyo looked back and forth between Aizawa and Midoriya. That's because I didn't have any practice. Why wouldn't you have practiced? I know how you are with quirks. I know you would want to know everything about your own. Midoriya gulped, shrinking down. Well, no, I mean, I didn't get my quirk until the entrance exam. Aizawa's mind halted. Midoriya didn't have his quirk until the entrance exam. The first time he used his quirk was when he blew up the zero-pointer and destroyed his limbs. That simultaneously made things make so much more sense and so much less at the same time. Kikuyo and Todoroki looked just as bewildered as Aizawa felt. Midoriya had shrunken as much as he could against the door. Snowfall looked like he couldn't decide between comforting Midoriya or Hiro. Both were quivering. Kikuyo clapped her hands. Okay, I'm not sure what we just stumbled upon, but that is enough information about your quirk for now. Midoriya, you are free to go. Midoriya fumbled for the doorknob and ran out of the room. Snowfall gave Hiro a lick and a sad look before trotting after Midoriya. Hiro was immediately up against Todoroki, still trembling like a leaf. Aizawa sighed. Another thing on his to-do list. Kikuyo smiled awkwardly, letting Satoshi wrap his tail around her wrist. Sorry about that. Didn't realize that was going to bring up some issues. Aizawa shook his head. It's fine. It was a long time coming anyway. Kikuyo didn't look so sure, but held up her clipboard and carried on with the exam. For the rest of the exam, Hiro was nervous and uncooperative, instead choosing to stay as close to Todoroki's side as possible. Todoroki seemed lost, but tried to comfort Hiro. Aizawa knew Hiro was on the trouble list, but he didn't think something would happen so soon. As Aizawa walked into the lecture hall, the class and their animals perked up. Aizawa spotted Midoriya back in his seat, trying to draw as little attention to himself as possible. Snowfall was trying to comfort him. Midoriya looked up and met Aizawa's eyes. He immediately looked away. Aizawa fought back a sigh. Todoroki moved past him and went to Midoriya's side. Can we go shopping now? Ashido asked. Yes, it is late though, almost past dinner time, so I'm giving you all 30 minutes to get what you need. Oh, what? Come on, can't we have a little longer? As cries began, Aizawa activated his quirk and the class went silent. I have had a long day. 30 minutes is feasible. If you know what you need and don't dilly-dally, you will have plenty of time. Kikuyo stepped forward. You all know what will be provided. The list doubles as the basics your soul animal needs. If you get everything on that list, you should be covered. Feel free to ask any of the employees if you need help. You guys are the last ones in the store for the day, so we are here just to help you. Aizawa checked his phone. It was 7:13. He held back a sigh as the class quickly filed out of the room and into the main store. When they all cleared out, Yamada put a hand on his shoulder. So, how did the checkups go? You look more tired than before. Aizawa rubbed his eyes. The soul animals are all happy and healthy, and many of them don't seem like they will be a lot of trouble, but the trouble animal list is still way too long. Yamada laughed. Yeah, that doesn't surprise me. I could tell some of them were trouble just by how they were acting out here. The little mouse was sneaking around and shocking other soul animals. I'm just glad he didn't shock the skunk. Pikachu was already shocking people. Great. Aizawa wished he could say he was surprised, but that would be a lie. The universe hated him too much. So many of them are soulmates. I've never heard of so many soul pairs in a single class before. Not to mention, I am almost certain I know who 3 of their soulmates are, and they all go to UA. Wait, who are the soul pairs? I noticed a few, but how many are there? Aizawa counted them out on his fingers. Midoriya and Todoroki, Hagakure and Ojiro, Uraraka and Asawi, Yaoyorozu and Jiro, Kaminari and Ashido, Kirishima and Bakugo, and Tokiyami and Shoji. 7 pairs. What? I was only able to figure out a few, but Tokiyami and Shoji, I never would have guessed. Yamada rubbed his temple. And you figured out who 3 others are? Spill! Aizawa sat down on one of the chairs against the wall, Yamada following him. Aoyama's raccoon is strikingly like Khan's trouble brat Monoma. Ida's owl, I'm almost positive, is Hatsume's soul representation, Majima's brat. And Koda's pony has an eerily similar quirk to one of Khan's other brats' pony. Yamada whistled. You really are getting all the trouble animals. Sorry for teasing you before. I wouldn't wish that on my worst enemies, let alone my husband. Aizawa rolled his eyes. Do you plan on telling the kids about their soulmates? Aizawa shook his head. It's not my place to interfere with that. It's all up to them, though I don't think it will take long for them to figure it out. If anything, Midoriya will let them know. I'm sure he'll want to do all kinds of experiments to figure out their quirks, and once he starts analyzing them, I have no doubt that he will realize who they represent. He probably already has entries in his journals about their quirks. Yamada nodded, his brow wrinkled. Speaking of Midoriya, What happened when he was pulled away? When he came back, he was curled in on himself and really nervous looking. He seemed like he was on the verge of a panic attack. Another item on my list of things to do. We just needed him to answer some questions about his quirk for Hero's file, and the kid had a breakdown. He cannot lie for the life of him. I'm not sure if he was lying or if he was just not telling us something, but something big is going on there. I need to get to the bottom of it. Yamada looked a bit worried, and Aizawa couldn't blame him. Midoriya was one of his favorite students. Hell, he was one of every teacher's favorite students. Aizawa couldn't deny that Midoriya had a place in his heart, though he would never say anything remotely close to that out loud. All right, I'll let you take care of it, but let me know if you need help with anything. Aizawa nodded and stood. We should get going. About 30 minutes have passed, so they should be good to go. I just want to get home so we can eat dinner and sleep. As they made their way out into the main store, they were immediately hit by a strong smell of peonies. The room was filled with blue-tinted gas. Aizawa's legs began trembling against his own will, and his heart began pounding. What is this? Yamada asked, his teeth chattering together. Flora's quirk. He ran into the room as best he could on jelly legs and scanned the aisles for Flora. Many of his students and their animals were huddled on the floor in little balls. Some of the employees were, too. Sero. Over here, Sero's voice called. He turned another aisle and found Sero tucked up against a shelf of dog food, Flora in his arms, shaking and still emitting gas. Aizawa canceled out Flora's quirk, but enough gas was in the air that it made little difference. Can you stand? Sero's eyes bounced all around the room. I don't know. He tried to stand, but his legs were shaking too much. Aizawa helped him up and began leading Sero to the exit, all while keeping his eyes on Flora. His eyes stung from dry eye, but he didn't let up. We need to get Flora out of here, and then clear the store. Sero nodded shakily as they walked. When they finally got outside, Sero sucked in a deep breath. The gas was still in his system, but at least he wasn't breathing any new gas in. Aizawa dropped his quirk, and though Flora was still shaking, she didn't start emitting new gas. He would have to leave it at that. He ran back into the store. We need to clear the store, he called out. Anyone who can walk needs to get themselves and their soul animal out. If you can, assist someone else in getting out as well. 10 minutes later, the class, Yamada, and the staff were all outside. Aizawa walked up to Ikuyo, who was talking to one of her employees. Do you have everyone accounted for? Ikuyo smiled, her lips quivering. The gas's effects were still running through everyone. All his class had a tremor to them, and so did the soul animals. I have everyone accounted for, thank you. Satoshi was coiled tightly around her waist and her shoulders. Of course, I'm sorry this happened. She nodded, and Aizawa made his way over to Sero, who was talking to Ashido and Kaminari. They silenced when he approached. So, would you care to tell me what happened? Sero gulped. Well... Wait, it's not his fault, it's ours, Ashido exclaimed. Kaminari nodded frantically along with her, though he looked a bit pale. We were playing pranks by having Pikachu shock the soul animals. We didn't think about who we were shocking and had him shock Flora. And then she freaked out and started using her quirk. But it was all our fault. Please, don't blame Sero or Flora. We're sorry. They finished together and bowed their heads. The area was silent. The whole class was watching them. Aizawa sighed heavily and rubbed his forehead. He tried to force his shaking to stop. Detention for a week, and you two are on chore duty for the next week as well. They looked like they wanted to protest, but with a stern look, their mouths clacked shut. Aizawa turned to the rest of the class. Who was able to get their stuff? Ida stepped forward, his hand shaking as he waved them about. Sir, almost everyone was able to get their items and move them onto the bus. There are a few more things that must be purchased, but otherwise we're clear to go. Okay, who still needs to get some things? Shoji and Kota raised their hands. All right, everyone else load up the bus. We will be heading back to the dorms shortly. He had Yaoyorozu make a few gas masks so the rest of the supplies could be collected, and send Shoji, Kota, and an employee on their way. I am terribly sorry, Miss Ikuyo. Aizawa bowed. Ikuyo waved it off. It's all right, no harm done. That is one powerful quirk, though. It is. The gas should all be cleared out by tomorrow morning. Then everything works out. With a quick goodbye, Aizawa made his way over to Yamada, who was resting against one of the buses. 3 of them have completely new and unknown quirks. Yup. Good luck, Shota. Thanks. He was going to need it. All right, listeners, this concludes When Shopping with Soul Animals, the second part of the When Soul Animals Appear series the author did. Let me know your thoughts and reactions to this series. I think the author did a nice job with this. I think there was a lot of Really interesting concepts related in this one as compared to the last one. I think you had more of a world building type of mentality to it, where you got to get more background on soul animals and the way they use quirks and just the whole concept of the AU itself. So I am eager to hear what you all thought. This is the last fic in the series that the author did, so there's nothing past this. If you like the fic and you have an opportunity to slide over to AO3 and leave comments and kudos to the original author, I think that would be great. And as always, thank you so much for listening.